The message is very, very clear. Stay home.
It's not the time to travel.
So, Mr. Trudeau, show us the plan for these doses you've promised.
This budget makes a historic investment in early learning and childcare.
What happened to Indigenous people and what has happened to Indigenous people in this country is genocide.
Her Excellency, the Right Honourable Mary May Simon.
The government, and indeed Parliament, needs an opportunity to get a mandate from Canadians.
That was an attack for sure against Quebec. Come on, it's unacceptable.
It has been the worst period in my life in many respects.
About 12 minutes ago, the aircraft carrying Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor left Chinese airspace, and they're on their way home.
The speech from the throne mentioned inflation once.
British Columbia is in stress and in crisis as a result of successive weather events.
I apologize to the thousands of Canadians who were harmed.
The fact is that the Assemblée nationale du Québec has full, entire, and legitimate jurisdiction over this issue.
Incredibly, that was all just in the past year. If 2020 was unprecedented, well, let's just say that 2021 also saw its fair share of crises, from the pandemic, of course, to the changing climate, to the Canadian military, and more. And hey, it was also an election year. So it's that time where we look back on some of the political highs and lows and ahead to what next year in Canadian politics could bring. Here to do that, of course, with me is At Issue, Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, Althea Raj, and Elamine Abdul-Mahmoud. Whenever our lovely producer Ariel puts those packages together, my mind kind of explodes because I've forgotten half the things that have happened through the year. Chantal, I'm going to start with you on this one. One word to describe the year in politics and why.
I'm glad you're going to start with me because I'm going to start cheating. And then the others can also do the same thing. So I picked two words, perfect storm. This was the year when the pandemic obviously dominated Canada in many more ways than one and very much defined politics. But it was also the year when the impact of climate change, I think, really started to register for a lot of people because of the events, in particular in BC, but not exclusively, that kind of drew the pattern for the future. So combine those two, and you have the ingredients of two phenomenons that dominate politics, but that politicians have very little control over.
Okay, Althea, will you also be a cheater? One word to describe politics.
If I can cheat, I'd say Groundhog Day, because I feel like we're just exactly at the same spot that we were last year. We've had a federal election with the same results, and who knew Omicron was going to bring us to where we are now. I feel like in some ways a lot has changed, but so much has not, and it kind of feels like we're in that Bill Murray movie where you can't seem to get out of it. It was something people usually watch at this time of year. Andrew Coyne, one word for you, or two, or four at this point.
Well, Rosemary, as you know, I have no time for cheaters. So I have one word, and that word is stasis. So I'm sort of making a similar point to Althea. I mean, every year is eventful, but this was actually not that eventful. We remained in the grip of this pandemic for most of the year, immobilized in various sorts of ways, including our politics. And yes, the election that was supposedly going to be the most important election since 1945, it didn't change anything, really.
Okay,
so,
yeah, sorry, Andrew, to cut you off. Go ahead, keep going.
No, I'm done.
Okay, Elamine, over to you.
I would say maybe the opposite, actually. The word for me for this year is probably nimble, in the sense that we've actually had to move through a bunch of different political seasons. If you guys remember, around January of this year, we were wondering when the shots were going to be in arms, and whether the travel advisors would be lifted and people can travel again. And we're back in that place now, but we took quite a journey to get there. The world opened up. We vaccinated a lot of this country, and then things started ratcheting up again, and then now we're back here. So I think politicians have had to maybe find a bunch of different modes to speak throughout this year. So I would say you divide it into a bunch of neat seasons. One is that stasis of the early this year, and then we had to go into an election season. Now we're back in the same place we were, but it required a lot of quick shifting on behalf of politicians anyway.
Okay, time is moving quickly, so I'm going to skip to the third question. What was with the third question? The greatest political challenge of the year, and because I cut you off, Andrew, you start us off.
I think it's pretty clear that the pandemic, you know, it's partly the pandemic itself, it's partly the wave upon wave of misinformation and misunderstanding that's out there. And it's only compounded as the year wore on, and supposedly we were all going to be out of it, you know, in 3 months or 6 months or 9 months, and here we are still stuck in it. There's good reasons for that, but it's making it harder and harder, I think, to sustain public focus on this.
Chantal, biggest challenge?
There is no doubt it's the pandemic. It's unprecedented. It's open-ended. There is no playbook for it. And it is saving or killing political leadership. Look at what happened to Jason Kenney over the past year. Mostly pandemic-related. He is the most experienced premier based on his federal experience. Look at what happened to Premier Ford in Ontario, who's not doing too badly and was really the rookie when he first came to power in Ontario. So it has changed the conventional way where we assess politicians, and some of them have lost their balance along the way.
Althea.
Same. I think vaccination probably was the greatest challenge of the year, if that was like the big thing going into 2021, which has been rather remarkable. But keeping ahead of the pandemic, I think, is the biggest challenge of 2021.
Elamine.
I guess if we could drill more into that, it would be sort of the way the pandemic altered the political leaders' radar for what's most important. Whether it's wanting to talk about the economy when people are really worried about vaccines, or wanting to talk about inflation when people are really worried about whether schools are going to be open. Nobody seems to be, you know, hitting quite the perfect note in terms of what every Canadian is worried about. So it feels like all politicians are kind of flying blind at the moment.
Okay, well, that brings me to the next question. You all sort of touched on in some ways, and that is who impressed you the most at any level with leadership? Elamine, you just ended, but why don't you start on that one?
I mean, I have to say, you know, it's the easy answer here, but I'm impressed most by the Prime Minister in terms of the way that he's navigated this year, because he went into that election with very high polling numbers, and then they started to dip in a way that made a lot of us wonder whether this really could be the end. And then by the end, he managed to sort of save his minority government and keep one. And I don't think that was, you know, I don't think that was a given or inevitable at all. So that was, for me, the political story of the year.
Althea.
Maybe this is a bit of a cheat, but I'm going to say nobody. This year marked me by the fact that I feel like I can't point to any particular political leader and say, wow, this person's leadership really marked me. And it's been a very divisive year in politics across Canada. And so the pandemic has affected so many people in different ways, and in ways that, frankly, were not the same ways that in 2020 affected them. So I feel like there's been a dearth, frankly, of political leadership.
How about you, Chantal?
I'm with Althea on this. I was trying, you know, going through the premiers, the prime minister, and the opposition leaders. There's a reason why Canadians re-elected just about the same House of Commons, and it's because nobody actually upped his or her game in a way that would have made people say, wow, this is who we want to look at. That's not to say that they did a bad job, but the question is, who impressed you most with his or her leadership? Not a year for that.
Okay, Andrew, let's see if you can bring it home then.
Nova Scotia Premier Tim Houston. The Tories have been out of power since 2006. We've just seen 4 straight provincial elections where the incumbents were re-elected. The Tories were behind 20 points in the spring. They were behind 10 points when the election was called, and he pulled it out. It was very much a personal triumph, both strategically and in terms of his own personal appeal. Yeah, I think he's the political winner of the year.
That's a good one. Okay, two more on this topic. Let's talk a little bit about the federal election. And this is going to be a terrible question for all of you. I know it already. The most memorable moment of the federal election, or, this might help you, the political turning point of the campaign. Chantal, you start on that one.
The most memorable moment was the election call. where the Prime Minister comes out of Rideau Hall and doesn't seem to have a narrative to explain why we're having an election. And the issue just dogged him for a number of weeks. The turning point, and that's not new, and in this, the election campaign was not different from previous ones, was the debates. That is where Erin O'Toole's momentum came to die, in part because of the contradictions between his platform, his leadership campaign, and his answers at the debate.
Chantal, Althea.
I'm going to go with debates as well, but I would say the English debate, the question that Sachi Curl, the moderator, asked of the Bloc leader, Mr. Blanchet, basically in her preamble accusing Quebec of being racist, of all Quebecers to be racist. You could have read in that. I think was very memorable, and for the Liberals and, well, some other political parties, but mostly the Liberals, a definite turning point for them.
Elamine.
I have to say, I have to agree with Chantal in terms of the day that we're calling the election and we're listening to the Prime Minister speak and waiting for him to set the narrative of what this election is going to be about. And then nothing comes. Nothing comes from that whole speech. And we spend, the following 2-3 weeks still with the question of what is this election about? And like normally this is the question that we kind of love and nobody out there in the world loves. But, it's stayed around for such a long time because there was nothing there.
Andrew.
The attack of the anti-vaxxers, the increasingly violent protests that dogged the Prime Minister, there's no evidence the Conservatives had anything to do with it. And substantively, we've seen these kinds of protests in other elections, but you could see Liberals' eyes light up when it happened, partly because when you're a leader, you always like to be under attack. You get to show your composure under fire. But more importantly, it allowed them to start talking again about vaccines and vaccine mandates. And that was their entry point to really press on the contradictions between Erin O'Toole and his base, between different sections of his party, and between what he was saying and what was in the platform. And ultimately, those are what took away his early lead in the election.
Okay, which political story didn't get enough attention this year, Althea?
I think the healthcare system. We talk around the healthcare system and we talk about the problems in the healthcare system, but really, how do we get to this point and how do we fix it? Is it that we need more hospitals? Do we need more doctors and nurses? Should more people be graduating and being allowed to enter medical school? Do we need to have a sort of reserve programs like we do with the forces where we train nurses who are on call and they come? How do we solve this problem looking 15, 20 years down the line? Because clearly we have a capacity problem that is causing all these lockdowns. How do we fix it? And I feel like we haven't really spoken about that at all, and frankly we should.
Andrew, most under-discussed political story.
Believe it or not, the Afghanistan disaster. We talked about it during the election for a few days, maybe a couple of weeks, and then it kind of dropped off the map in terms of at least political discussion. This was an utter catastrophe, not just for Afghanistan, but for the people that we had promised that we would look after. And they were basically thrown over the side, whether because the government had other things on its mind, i.e. the election, or just because they hadn't planned enough for it. But the results are pretty shocking and still going on.
Elamine.
I think the most overlooked story is actually it's a good story, which is how well the vaccine distribution is going in this country, the general uptake. We, as it turns out, we are a nation of rule followers. We like to get vaccines. We like to listen to what health officials are telling us, to the point where we have some of the best sort of vaccine numbers in the world. And I think that is a good story that we're not paying enough attention to because, of course, there's other things to worry about. But I think when we look back at that, I think we're gonna be proud of the fact that we're all sort of said, you know what, you need to take some vaccines. Sure, we're in, absolutely.
This is why I invite Elamine, because he has a positive outlook once in a while. Chantal, last word to you.
I think it's only just now dawning on a lot of Canadians, including observers, how the Canada-US relationship is not going back to what many people considered the normal. The post-Trump era is as challenging in many ways as the Trump era. With a possible new Trump era coming. I think while the story did get covered, it did not get the attention it would have gotten absent the pandemic.
We've been talking about the year in politics. Now let's take some time to look ahead. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, Althea Raj, Elamine Abdul-Mahmoud. Obviously, very much in flux the year ahead, so we'll try and make these questions kind of as general as possible. Let's start with the political leader or MP to watch in 2022. Althea.
Aaron O'Toole, how long can he survive as leader of the Conservative Party with his caucus going in all sorts of direction? And a lack of, I would say, fear, respect, pick your word of choice from caucus. I think that is the most politically fascinating story at the moment.
Elamine.
Mine's provincial, so Stephen Del Duca is the one that I'm interested in. How can the Ontario Liberal leader do in this upcoming provincial election? Doug Ford had all kinds of runway to sort of retell the story of how he handled the early days of COVID, but now the Omicron variant is here, and so he's up, back again against the ropes, and we'll see how Stephen Del Duca makes use of that.
Okay, Chantal.
It's related to Althea's. It sounded almost like a political death watch, so I'm going to watch Pierre Poilievre, the finance critic of the Conservative Party. Why? Because when you look at the potential benefactors from possible O'Toole demise, his name comes first, and it looks from the outside like he's using his finance critic position to actually campaign for the leadership.
Andrew Coyne.
Manitoba Premier Heather Stephenson. She came in with the Tories really back on their feet, back on their back feet, I should say, after the tumultuous regime of her predecessor. But she is, I think, a template perhaps for a more moderate, contemplative kind of Tory leader that I think people will be watching to see whether that can play with the grassroots and whether it can play with the general public.
That's what happens when you have two Manitobans on a panel. Eventually, Manitoba comes up. Okay, a political story you'll be watching in 2022, Althea.
Same answer as the one I just gave.
Okay.
You told us to be short on time. There we go.
I get it. There we go. Chantal, how about you?
No, for diversity, the Ontario and the Quebec elections, one in June, the other in September. And remember, at this point, both François Legault and Ford are ahead. So was Justin Trudeau this time last year.
Good point. Andrew?
I guess I'll put it in Aaron O'Toole here. He had a couple of good weeks towards the end of the year, but he's by no means out of the woods. There's a large section of the party that's extremely angry with him, and they can make trouble in low-level and high-level ways for a long time to come. It's going to be a real sort of battle of attrition.
Elamine.
The constant questions that Justin Trudeau has had his last election. And so I'll be watching for Chrystia Freeland. So just to see, if she's in fact the heir apparent, how does she behave if she's being, ready to take over the reins? So that's the thing to keep an eye on.
Okay, last one on this panel. The biggest political challenge for next year, Andrew.
Inflation.
I knew you were going to say it. I could have guessed that one.
Well, it's kind of a big issue. We haven't seen levels of inflation like this for 30 or 40 years. We know from the past that it can absolutely overturn politics. It is the single thing that is most likely to wreck an economic recovery, and people have a great fear of it as well. So we've let it get out of the bag, and now we have to try and stuff it back in.
Chantal.
For different reasons, economic policy at the federal level, not just for all the reasons Andrew described, but also because, as Elamine pointed out, Chrystia Freeland, Pierre Poilievre, that's where their sandbox is at this point.
Elamine, biggest political challenge?
I think it's going to be trust in government, trust in government and basically reliability. Like, we are in a moment where, the numbers for getting a booster shot are pretty low. Will the uptake continue to be as high now that we're asking people to get more of these shots? And also, will this be the last time that you're asking people to do that? And so I think trust in government after 2 years of having to sort of really work out that muscle might probably be beginning to atrophy.
And Althea, last one to you.
The pandemic. I feel like inflation and the economic maneuvering of the federal government all kind of will flow from what faces us in February, March, April, and then hopefully we are not back here again in December of 2022, because that would be really sad.
I hope the same thing. All right, thank you all. Chantal, Andrew, Althea, Elamine, that was a great conversation. Be well. Thank you.